us from. And since there are no conversations on the chats, I'm going to move on, and we will move back to Mr. Enya Acheng, the chairperson for the African Youth for Transitional Justice Policy, organization chairperson, their introductory remarks. Okay, and as we're waiting for Enya, I am going to just once again look to check in to see if our translation services are on. I believe colleagues have still not given me a heads up on that. Still waiting for Mr. Acheng to give us the entry remarks, and thereafter we have a particular video that will give us context exactly on what we'll be talking about as we zoom into Namibia as our case study for this week. He's ready for his opening remarks. I will now hand over to Mr. Enya Acheng before we move to the video that'll give us context. Enya, are you online? Enya, are you there?
Hi, sorry, I just can help with a bit of that. I think some of us are struggling a bit with connection issues again, and I believe that Enya is going to be joining in a little bit. So I've asked Dave to maybe step in and speak at the beginning, and maybe Enya can wrap us up again. So I know Dave is also trying to get his connection set up. So sorry again, everyone, for the technical issues, and really appreciate you being here today. I believe the interpretation should be working now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iman. Mr. David Taylor, are you ready for your introductory remarks?
Hi, most of you, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Now we can hear you,
Yes,
David.
we can hear you. I can hear you as well. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, sorry. Welcome and good morning to everybody. I apologize for the internet connection, but also to be jumping in and speaking in Enya's place at the very last minute. We've had some challenges, of course, with the connection, but also with I believe the time difference has created some difficulties for some of us for the participation today. But I'm delighted to be here. I will do my very best to give some very short marks to kind of fill and you perhaps at the end you can maybe give some closing remarks. It is probably enough for me to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here as Impunity Watch in support of the African Youth for Transitional Justice. For those of you who were perhaps here at the first webinar, but also for the policy brief that we're going to be exploring today is part of a series that the African Youth for Transitional Justice are producing, 5 policy briefs on the theme of legacy, exploring the continuing impacts of historical injustices, colonization, and the transatlantic slave trade, and how specifically that is affecting African societies today. Also, very specifically from a youth perspective. And so, as I said, Impunity Watch is incredibly happy to be supporting this wonderful initiative that is surely going to be not only bringing new perspectives, new voices, but it's hopefully going to be offering different perspectives onto what it means to be dealing with the past and transitional justice across the continent. Of course, at a time when reparations is a hugely important theme internationally, and as we know, with the African Union establishing 10 years of reparations for people of African descent. So I'm absolutely thrilled to announce that the second policy brief, as many of you have seen, has already been published. Stephen has done an absolutely tremendous job in not only articulating the importance of reparations in the context of Namibia, but also articulating just why intergenerational traumas, why mental health and psychosocial support means much more than simply dealing with a specific violation, but must go to look at not only reparations, but also systems, the way that those abuses were brought about in the first place. I don't want to take away from the wonderful presentation that I'm sure Stephen is going to be presenting in a few moments. Just to say that Impunity Watch, we are absolutely thrilled to be able to support Stephen. His analysis is not only sharp, but it's at a critical moment. And for me, the piece that he produced was an absolute joy to be reading, in spite, of course, of the fact that it was dealing with an incredibly difficult subject. But the way that he writes, the way that he transmits these ideas, and the way that he pushes us to think much more about mental health and psychosocial support in a transitional justice context, astounding, I must say. So with that, I'm going to close, because I'm very, very eager to hear from Stephen and to have you all discover the incredible work that he's done. So thank you very much for the conversations, and Moza, I throw it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for the opening remarks. Indeed, the platform has given many a young youth, not just the authors themselves, but who the authors interact with, an opportunity to share their perspectives on what intergenerational justice and youth inclusion looks like in transitional justice landscape, particularly in Africa, as we seek to reimagine what that looks like ahead of important aspects like Agenda 2063. And so at this particular point, I am going to once again just find out if Inya is able to project the video that we have to give us a background on the genocide, the history of colonization and genocide in Namibia, as well as our conversation for today. Inya, if you're ready, over to you.
It's known as the Forgotten Genocide. It's known as the Forgotten Genocide, and it was carried out during Germany's brutal occupation of Namibia. Prior to colonization, a number of indigenous groups such as the Herero, Nama, the Damara, the San, and many others lived in Namibia freely. In 1884, Germany formally colonized German Southwest Africa. It began confiscating indigenous land and stealing cattle. Indigenous people were also used as slave labor to till their own stolen land. As the occupation of the land continued, life became unbearable for many indigenous groups. In January 1904, a group of Hereros led by Chief Samuel Maherero carried out a rebellion against German settlers. 123 colonists were killed. The German military took up arms against the Herero, who did not have the weaponry of the Germans. By June 1904, the Hereros and Germans were negotiating a surrender. But this all changed when Germany appointed Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha. He abandoned negotiations and surrounded the Herero, killing between 3,000 and 5,000 Herero fighters. Despite this, many of the Herero managed to escape and tried to flee across the desert to the British Protectorate in modern-day Botswana. But Trotha ensured the military pursued Herero men, women, and children. Many were shot to death, poisoned through drinking water in wells, or died of thirst and starvation. But it didn't stop there. In October 1904, Trotha passed an order to kill every Herero man, armed or unarmed man, on sight, and to shoot at women and children. Thousands of Herero were murdered in cold blood. In November 1904, the order was overturned. The surviving Herero population was to be transferred into concentration camps. Herero women were subject to sexual violence and rape. The concentration camps had poor hygiene, little food, and used forced labor and medical experiments. Some historians estimate that the mortality rate was between 50 and 70%. In 1905, another group called the Nama rose up against German colonists. The conflict lasted 2 years. People from the Nama were executed or incarcerated in camps with the Herero. Historians estimate that 50 to 65,000 Herero, or 80% of the entire population, and 10,000 Nama, or 50% of the entire population, were killed by the Germans. For many years, Germany acknowledged there were atrocities but ruled out any compensation. In 2018, it returned human remains to Namibia, which were used in widely discredited research proving the racial superiority of Europeans. After 5 years of negotiation with the Namibian government, in 2021, Germany finally acknowledged that it committed genocide during the colonial occupation of Namibia and agreed to provide development funds of $1.34 billion over the next 30 years for infrastructure, health, and training. Germany says it will not make individual payments, pay reparations, or compensate survivors. But many activists say it's too little, too late.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for sharing and, providing us important background information on the subject matter for today, in that colonization affects not just, important historical elements, but shape so many important aspects that Stephen will be highlighting in his policy brief. And so just to give us a brief background on our author for today, Stephen Bernardus Harageib is a passionate youth development practitioner and dedicated advocate for transitional justice and mental health, with over a decade of experience in the non-profit and government sectors. Stephen has worked extensively across Africa, promoting social change through community engagement, policy development, and advocacy. He founded Conversations for Change, a social enterprise providing mental health support to young leaders, and PGPR Technologies, a startup addressing food security challenges in Africa. In this particular conversation, to facilitate it, we are joined by Madame Angeline Abua, who is a human rights lawyer and development practitioner leading youth-centered transitional justice initiatives across Africa. As executive director and co-founder of the Youth Organization for Research and Justice Advocacy, she drives innovative advocacy and capacity building programs that empower young people in post-conflict contexts. Her work has been featured in GIZ, a U report, as a model for meaningfully including youth in justice processes and peace-building efforts across the continent. Angeline has co-authored policy briefs on inclusive spaces for youth women in TJ and helped design platforms for youth-led governance across Africa. Through her work, she advocates for moving youth from victims to active agents of change. She's committed to linking development, justice, and youth participation to build inclusive, equitable governance across Africa. Without any further, I will now hand over to Madame Angeline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Musa, for that very warm introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Angeline Abua, and I'm very honored to join you here today as a member of the African Youth for Transitional Justice platform, where I represent East Africa. And of course, it's a privilege as well to moderate this very, very, critical conversation on reparative justice in the context of Namibia, which is, I believe, is one of the few, African nations that are actively pursuing formal reparations for colonial atrocities. So this policy brief that we are going to be discussing today by Steven Harageib, when I was reading it, I was just lighting up, and as David has mentioned, his writing is perfect, So we're going to be discussing his policy brief on what does justice feel like? And he offers a very powerful reframing of justice, which is not just in the legal transaction that we all think about, but more like a felt, experience that is rooted in memory and dignity and also healing. And of course, when I was reading Stephen's brief, it traces, a very painful history of Namibia from 1904 to 1908 regarding the genocide of the Herero and the Nama people. Through the decades of apartheid to the present day. And I was shocked at seeing some of these numbers that are community, some of the percentages that, I was reading in this brief, I couldn't even believe it. So, your brief really, really challenged me. And I believe it challenged every one of us who has gone through it in terms of confronting some of the gaps that are there in psychological healing, especially around intergenerational trauma and youth marginalization. But I do not want to preempt what Stephen has in store for us today. So I believe we can begin. But first, before we can delve into some of the findings, perhaps, Stephen, you could walk us through, what inspired this research. What are some of the personal or community-based influences that led you to particularly frame reparations in Namibia through the lens of psychological healing, emotional justice, and intergenerational trauma? Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Angelique, for that beautiful introduction, and greetings to everybody, colleagues, friends, for joining us today for this important conversation. I think to start us off, really, the idea came to me having worked in the mental health space for a very long time, engaging with communities. I often think about what does policy mean for people on the ground, right? How do we make policy or even laws feel more closer to people's lives? And I approach the question of reparations as somebody who sees justice really, not as something that is some you put on a piece of paper as an instrument, but really think about the ecosystem on a conducive environment that allows for folks to feel like they can participate, which allows for memory, for that idea of feeling, and the issues even around the African feminist thought, right? Which talks about repair beginning in the body and in the home, and how we talk about care and emotional labor as part of political acts, which we don't often talk about when we speak about transitional justice. This thinking really taught me that when you talk about the silencing of and the issues around repair, that's when we started to challenge these issues, right? And developmental psychology, which I studied and practiced, really gave us vocabulary and gave me vocabulary to kind of trace some of the logic across generations, right? Of how trauma often mutates, how we think about attachment, identity, the issues of trust, and particularly for Namibia, which has had 35 years of independence after decades of apartheid rule, colonialism, genocide, and the psychosocial raptures that we often see, but often don't have the language to name what we are seeing, and the kinds of fractures that often move quietly, both on an individual level, but in families, but also in communities as well. And this understanding helped me to see reparations not just as an event that needs to happen or something that we are paying to silence, but as thinking about recovery, because we have to recognize the harm and the extent of that harm so that we can be able to think about what does repair then look like. And that part of that repair is establishing that emotional safety, right? Reawakening that sense of belonging, which often when you talk to people or about people without understanding what the experiences of folks are, is where we often get it wrong. And I thought about the issues around psychopolitical theory as well, which also inspired me to think about the issues of political structures, how they also carry unprocessed emotion and trauma, and how a state in and of itself can deny, through its denial of a group's experience, can continue to project injury, right? And the importance of empathetic care, especially in societies where there has been harm perpetrated. But also beyond moving, and I guess moving beyond just the usual disciplines that are in the reparations conversation, because often when I found myself in many of these rooms, it will be policymakers, politicians, it is lawyers, human rights defenders who are in the room, and often the social sciences are not as prevalent in that room, and those voices are not as elevated. And I guess that's why I wanted to expand the language of transitional justice itself, really, to make space for that emotions, to make space for the issues of silence, for what is called how people see themselves and how they operate and how they move. I wanted to stretch really how we're talking about this language in a way that talks about the issues of grief, issues of intergenerational dignity. What does it mean for wounding and those who are wounded, and what does it mean for trying to restore that woundedness, and words that often belong in our policy frameworks, such as truth commissions and non-recurrence. What does it actually mean for communities? How does that actually show up? And I wanted to expand that a little bit more. And I guess one of the other things I also wanted to really raise when you talk about reparations is thinking about the ritual of integration, because when there is violence, often that violence is ruptures, right? And part of the repair means reintegration, and a way for that nation, for nations to kind of come together and to bring that emotional and structural selves into coherence is important. And that's what I mean when I say justice must be psychosocially grounded. It has to heal both the emotional climate of governance, and not just talking about the economic or development as an intervention. Therefore, I guess the reframing for me has been around taking reparations not just as a transactional issue, but as something that is relational, something that is both developmental and also intergenerational. And a project that I think that we have to think of from a healing perspective, what African scholars often term as restorative futures, where we're not just imagining justice from what has happened in the past or looking backward, but in terms of thinking forward, in terms of the lives of those who are yet to be born and the kind of societies that we want to build.
Thank you very much for that intervention. And it's true that in most cases, people would ideally just think about some of the physical, dispossession, but we often forget some of the psychological ruptures and disruptions to identity, to the communities, and some of this, intergenerational trust that ideally still, shape, or rather still have an influence on the societies that are affected by conflict, or whether it is, atrocities that were committed during the colonial era. And maybe over to my next question. In your policy brief, you frame justice as something that must be felt, and I believe you've mentioned a bit on it, but I'd like to hear more on your insights on justice as something that must be felt rather than declared. This is very powerful. So what are some of the personal encounters that influenced this very emotional justice lens? Thank you.
Sure. I think the idea came again through conversations, really. And I see myself as a conversationalist with different folks, both in a therapeutic setting and in non-therapeutic settings as well. And what really comes to the fore often when you talk about development or development projects, they are stuff that is done for people. As opposed to saying, what is your experience, and trying to understand somebody's emotional landscape and geography, if I can call it for that, for lack of a better word. And recognizing that somebody's heart and feelings equally have a significant role to play in how folks show up in our development space. For example, if a family feels like they are not participating in this national identity of Namibia, that has an impact in terms of how they vote, whether they show up to the polls or not, has an impact in do they seek for support from government or from civil society, It has an impact in terms of how they raise their children and what they tell them to say. You need to, for example, be self-sufficient, or you cannot trust because these people are going to promise you something and not get and deliver it. So when you think about it, that's on an individual level. But when you think about it more on a collective level, if that translates, what happens is that there's an insulation that takes place, right? And when atrocities particularly happen, as I mentioned in the brief, one of the hero elders who talks about how they bury our people but not our pain, it's how that often shows up, right? It's easy to kind of say, oh, like we're gonna have a process for burial and then move on. But we don't have a conversation around what does it mean for somebody who has been harmed? How do they start to recover? How do they start to process what has taken place? How do they start to trust and have a sense of self? Because you must understand, this has been decades and over a century of dispossession, of being told that you're inferior. It's being told that you are non-existent, you don't belong, you are and you're almost dehumanized for so long. And to now rebuild that bit, that psychological work, it takes time. And I think often we think about repair only from a place of we've built a school, we've built a clinic, and therefore the communities are fine. But we've not done the deeper work to actually understand what is the level of wounding and how do we help families to actually restore. And when we even talk about the issues around, particularly the genocide, right? We have celebrated the Genocide Remembrance Day last year for the first time after 120 years in our national calendar. And again, that talks about the issue of silence, right? And how silence of its in of itself can be kind of an exile, because if you don't acknowledge and celebrate, or at least commemorate what has taken place, we are then denying the impact of that work, right? We're denying the impact of that harm of what has actually taken place, which actually then translates for many as saying then my pain and what I'm experiencing is seen as not valid. And again, that erasure or even the silence thereof has an impact in terms of how people then show up. Therefore, for me, silence justice must be felt is about people feeling like they are participating. And that's why I talk about justice being relational, transitional justice being relational. It's that people are participating, they are engaging, they are feeling that they can add value. You can even dissent without feeling that idea of that you will be pushed aside and that you will not be seen. Or that in the pursuit of being connected in a group, that you don't then stand in your authentic truth, right, about what you're experiencing. And that's often what we don't talk about, because in communities, especially like Namibia and where there's post-conflict, when people are articulating something that might be contrary to our national conversation, it can be seen that that person is seen as a traitor or seen as somebody who is anti-development or anti. And I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game of this versus that, but really saying that we recognize that there has been harm perpetuated against our people. And part of that means that we need to do repair work. And repair work means we need to understand and hear the truth of what somebody is saying so that we can actually respond accordingly. Otherwise, what ends up happening is we assume what people need and therefore give them that. And that doesn't then do anything to heal. And therefore, that justice doesn't feel any more different. Even if you have 100 schools around here, if you're not addressing the real need that I'm actually expressing.
Wow. It's interesting to and sad as well. Yeah, that you had the Remembrance Day for the first time, seeing that some of these atrocities happened in the early 90s, and of course this means that there is an intergenerational gap, and denying the impact of what happened, definitely this invalidates the pain of the people who are already affected, by some of these conflicts. But allow me to just take you back a bit, because you have brought about the aspect of memorialization. which is a very, very key pillar of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Perhaps in a nutshell, for those of us who are not well versed with the history of Namibia, and I believe Musa has showcased a short video, but in a nutshell, could you please just take us through the history of Namibia and why we are even having this conversation before we go to the key findings?
Sure, I think that's an important line for us to consider. And Namibia's history, as I write in the brief, unfortunately doesn't begin in Namibia. It begins in Berlin. And it begins with that Berlin conference that basically came with the scramble of Africa, where Namibia was under German colonial rule, where Namibia was known as German Southwest Africa. And after that was under protectorate of South Africa, and then came under apartheid rule. I think that was after 1915. And then in 1990, we got independence. So we've only been independent Namibia is one of the youngest democracies on the continent, independent for only 35 years. But for almost 120 years, even longer, we have faced multiple atrocities, right? It is the genocide that has happened. It was the land dispossession that has taken place. It was the apartheid that has come through, segregation, all of those harms that had been perpetrated against Namibians. And then in 1990, we get independence. And then now we have the work of now rebuilding. And part of also that has been, of course, the policy of national reconciliation that said that any crimes perpetrated before 1990 are not going to be tried in the spirit of national reconciliation. That was what was decided. But unfortunately, we have not redressed a lot of that harm that has then taken place 35 years into our democracy. And that's why memorization is not just really a symbolic exercise, in my opinion. It's an emotional anchor that we need to provide for folks to be able to see that the harm that was perpetrated is something that is actually acknowledged and seen as harm. The sites of atrocity, for example, where at Shark Island, which is a concentration camp that was built even before the Holocaust. Again, a lot of what has happened in the Holocaust was in the concentration camps there was happening in Namibia as well, right? Where women, for example, were called to be domestic workers there, cleaning up after those who had locked them up, as far as even like cleaning the skulls of their fellow community members for them to be shipped off. And just imagine what that must feel like when you have to sit and get a body of somebody whom you probably knew in your community, and you're told you need to clean off that skull, and you're washing that skull for them to be, for all the eugenics to happen and for them to be tested and stuff like that. We don't talk about that. The fact that a lot of those folks were chased out of their land, was dispossessed. They were pushed into the desert, killed, shot, along. Yes, the extermination order of Van Torte was, the infamous one, was definitely given. But long before and after, there was also that killing that was taking place, murder that was taking place, the sexual violations of our women taking place. And when we have had so much disruption and harm perpetrated against communities, and then to just say, we are then now moving on like nothing has happened, must feel and does feel like an erasure and a simplification of somebody's harm. And that's why the work of justice feeling is so critical, because it allows folks to actually say, this is what has been done. We have a reckoning for all of us to think about, to say, how do we then try to bring restoration through? And that's what memorialization for me, and grief becomes an issue of governance more than an individual issue. Because I think often when you talk about mental health, and issues around psychosocial support, we say it's on an individual level. Yes, it is. But at the same time, it is a governance issue. It cannot just be the responsibility of the one to do the work of health, healing, and repair. It has to be institutionalized healing that we need to think about. And that's where become memory is also part of the repair, to say that we remember what the harm that has been, right? All of the time when we talk about atrocities, is saying we'll never forget. But we can't forget if we don't name the harm that has happened. And that's why it's important for us to do that memorization.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for highlighting that. I believe it was very important to, first of all, understand, the history and the context of the country before we can move into the findings. And once again, before we move into the findings, I note in your methodology, you are relying mostly on desk review and some of the archival sources. So I was just wondering, how did you navigate, the gaps in data, especially around youth and gendered experiences, to ensure that, there's that analytical robustness?
Sure. So I wove together the oral histories and really thought about feminist ethnography, social work research, developmental psychology, to try and build a sort of a psychosocial map to think about how trauma and inequalities show across generations. And that's in the absence of that data being so robust. And of course, we also understand that archives in of themselves are not neutral, right? They are curated absences that happen as well. So was to think about the work against the archives, to see what lives in the margins, what's in the missionary diaries, in family oral histories, and again, thinking about the contemporary youth work that is happening here as well, and try and find a way to marry those. And I realized, I guess for me, memory in that sense is also data, right? And part of what we often talk about oral history, particularly in our African culture, is that we don't take that as like robust evidence. And I think what I was trying to pull from there through that recorded stories of many Herero elders, Nama elders, and those who kind of spoke about their experiences, was to try and translate that in a way that captures that a little bit more. So really I try to use a lot of their testimonials from what is already written, even if it's transmitted as sometimes silence in some parts. I try to kind of cover a nice wide variety. And then even using songs and gestures. And when you listen, I guess that way you begin to build a form of evidence that both holds the truth of what communities experience, but at the same time that emotional presence as well. And a lot of the data that I also used was from a lot of descendants themselves who had written their own accounts and perspectives, and then try to pull that and try and think about it from a psychosocial perspective, the psychological perspective, the African feminist theory, and try and layer that against what they have produced. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. Now, just to move into some of the key findings, in your brief, you highlight the aspect of quote unquote waithood and psychological paralysis, especially among the youth. And as a young person in Namibia, how do some of these concepts help reframe youth not just as victims of historical trauma, but also for young people to also be agents of reparative transformation?
Sure. So I use the issue of waithood to describe what that in-between space, right? Where young people are often find. You're too young to be in specific spaces, and you're too old to be in other spaces. So you're in a little bit of a waithood. Like that's kind of where young people find themselves up. And where freedom is technical but not often tangible. And it's something that was termed by, I think, a Tunisian young person. I think it was Homewana, yes, that it is where I think opportunity is there for young people to imagine what change and development looks like, right? And when I speak of concepts like waithood and psychosocial paralysis, they aren't meant necessarily to it's to name the conditions that I think young people are born into. And in Namibia, this manifests as a generation carrying an inherited silence. And within that silence lies energy, its vibrancy to actually change. And I think we're starting to see that in the last almost 5 years, just I think pre-COVID 2019 through, where young people are taking ownership of memory, right? They're going in, reading and understanding the histories, going to the archives, going to the museums, challenging what is in front of us. I think one of the first, for example, was a young person leading a church petition in the city of Windhoek to pull down a statue of one of the militaries from previous colonizers, right? And saying that we cannot celebrate those who have harmed us in such a public manner, whilst at the same time, oh, sorry, is there a message from the chat? Okay, so I was trying to speak a bit more slowly. Sorry about that. I get too excited. So I think what's critical, as I was saying, is young people are then engaging and saying we need to pull down statues, for example, that are celebrating those who were oppressors. We need to now challenge the iconography that's around us that celebrates a specific kind of narrative around Namibia's history. And that's what we started to see young people engaging in that level. We're seeing that even recently, last week, for example, young people are saying, we want to talk about the issue of genocide. We're no longer going to be silenced around it. So if our parents or our grandparents may not feel comfortable to speak about it, or politicians may not feel comfortable to speak about it, they're going to have that conversation. And what they're doing, for example, is they hosted like a theater play with visiting German students from Germany and Namibian students to the collaborative musical play where they talked about the genocide. So using arts and crafts to be able to articulate some of these issues. So they are reclaiming really through music, art, and activism, really emotional literacy of what that actually means. Because often people think when you talk about the genocide or issues of atrocities, that it's too sensitive to have that conversation. And then that's why we end up in silence. And silence is a form of also harm, really, and violence, right? And that psychosocial paralysis is what often comes in for many people, which captures the stagnation that is caused by trauma, which is both denied and normalized. And because we've normalized this iconography and statues in a specific area, we don't think it's even wrong. It's young people saying that is actually not normal. We must actually push back against it. And they got pulled it down, it was removed after a couple of months of that young person pushing for that. It's young people going to places like the gallows in the coast and saying, this is where harm has been perpetrated. We need to elevate the situations. We cannot normalize this behavior. And youth are transforming that, right? They're using that that energy and saying that we are teaching ourselves our history, and we are also confronting the harm that was perpetrated in our history as well, and are honest enough to say that we're not going to allow that to then keep us in the state of paralysis, but actually use that as almost the energy to actually challenge the status quo. And I guess it's where often theory talks about how a generation that was colonized becomes a generation of renewal as well. And part of what young people are doing is that they're unafraid to tell the truth of what has taken place. And I think that's really, really critical, because I think in the spirit of trying to be reconciliatory, we've been silenced and we kind of push things to the fore. And young people are saying we can tell the truth and still reconcile. And I think that's very powerful that young people are engaging with and using their creativity through that, right? Using social media to even talk about hashtag pull down the gallows, right? And using those and that energy of that to be able to galvanize other young people and build a movement that actually says the history of Namibia has to be told in its fullness. And that's why we're starting to see that as well, right? They are rewriting in real time what is actually taking place. And I'm really excited about that. We even have are seeing now young people studying language, culture, and going into their PhDs using African Namibian traditional culture as part of their thesis that they're studying as well, with the idea of saying we're also decolonizing not just what is outside, but even how we think about education and how we do our education and pedagogy within our research, etc., which is really fantastic. But that's the energy that is coming from the young people, literally ground up.
Thank you for that. And you said, you know, the young people, the youth, we are a generation of, you know, renewal. And it's very refreshing to see that the script is the same across Africa, because we have the same thing happening in Kenya. Young people are using art and social media. And for the Kenyan context, we had, you know, young people, high school students who were literally, you know, acting out the history of the country. And of course, this principal for that particular school definitely was suspended by the government, because they do not want us to learn the truths about the history of our country. But young people are saying, no, enough is enough. And they're doing this themselves by going to learn about the true history and teaching the other people about what the history looks like, so that they're not detached from that. And this is very, very refreshing. And it's so sad that, you know, in Africa and in our countries, our history is still, I'm sorry to use this word, bogus, because it's the history that the white man wants us to learn, and it's not the true history of our countries and of our context. So it's very refreshing to hear that the script is the same across Africa, whether it's in Gambia, whether it's in Namibia, whether it is in Madagascar right now, or Kenya. It is the same, and young people are moving beyond and basically, you know, spreading the message in a way that fits them. And I happened to have attended the African Union Forum, and it was very refreshing to see, you know, the art and the performance, and we were there, and I could not understand what they were saying because they were speaking in French, but you could relate, you could see the message that they were sending. And of course, this shows the power in art, in spreading some of these messages. But before, you know, sometimes I could go on and on and on, but let's move on to the next. Let's move back to your policy brief, where you described, you know, structural violence as invisible, quote unquote, yet persistent. And I found this to be very, very interesting. So what are some of the indicators that you believe are most effective in making this low violence legible to policymakers and also to some of the donors?
Sure. And I think the first step is to call it for what it is, right? It's harm that is often woven deeply in our laws, in our policies, and shows up in our economics as well. And just because we don't see it in front of our eyes doesn't mean that its impact is not as felt as well. Namibia's inequality statistics are startling. We are probably one of the most unequal societies. And with a general GDP range, when you think about it, an average GDP range, when you look at our GDP, you can think, oh, this is actually quite wealthy. We were classed as an upper middle class country for the longest time. We only got downgraded, I think, this year to a lower middle class country. But for the most part, we're upper middle class. And that's because the average earnings of a very small minority is so high against the earnings of a big majority. And Namibia being 3 million people, again, is very, very stark. And what I raise particularly in the brief really is around the issue of land, where 70% of our land is still in the hands of minorities who were previously advantaged. And part of that has been, again, our legacy, right, of colonialism, of land dispossession that has taken place. And part of that also then means that 16% of our land, partly right now, is only owned by Black folks, which is about 90% of the country. And so when you think about those kind of issues, that's when you start to see inequality come in. Structural violence, again, is also in the form of how many of families were raised, right? Like the kind of education you could access was Bantu education prior to independence, where many Black folks didn't go to university. They would get to grade 10 or to a specific grade and then pretty much then go on a different path. So when you talk about, sorry.
Going to the gym.
And that's how we again see it as well, right? How the limitation of our Bantu education system that didn't provide for opportunity for folks to pursue a degree, me being the first in my family to get a degree, and me being one of the few that are able to do so, tells us that structural violence continues to still have an impact. Those inequalities still has an impact because your social mobility and your economic opportunity is materially deprived based on your education pathways that you're on as well. Namibia having again one of the highest unemployment youth statistics, I think with about 37%, again tells us that we've not done enough in terms of our industries to be able to absorb even young people to be able to have that economic opportunities as well. And there's, of course, have been a Black elite that have benefited from post-independence, but that has not translated into a majority Black communities across the continent, I mean, across Namibia, to actually be economically viable. And so I guess when you talk about economic net mapping and emotional impacts, right, is where we start to see that structural violence often coming in, because it's easy to say, no, we're independent now, we're moving on, everything is fine. But it's not, because we see that residual impacts. Because if a family has dropped out of school, didn't have education, the likelihood of that child not having education materially also increases as well. Those being caught in the cycles of poverty as a result, and those then becomes to rebirth itself across generations as well. So for us to interrupt that harm means that we have to have psychosocially grounded economic policies that actually look at the lived experiences of folks who are land dispossessed, who don't have economic opportunities, who don't have strong educational outcomes, to be able to bring that redress in that level as well.
Thank you for that. And I'm being informed that we have 10 minutes. So let's quickly move to some of your recommendations. And, you recommended, your recommendations span in truth-telling, psychological healing, land restitution, and feminist leadership. So how do you envision these pillars being integrated within the Namibia's context, TJ architecture, and also in Africa as a whole? And perhaps you can also touch a bit on your proposal for a National Youth Reparations Council.
Sure. I'll run us through real quick. So I think how I think about my recommendations is really not necessarily as step by step, but thinking about a holistic response, right? And truth-telling has to be the key, right? And must be paired with psychosocial healing. Land reform has to happen because that reduces our reparations to, if you only think about land reform without remembrance of what has actually taken place, we can only talk about land redistribution. But it has to be accompanied with actually what is the harm that has been taking place. And the AU policy, for example, the TJ policy provides us a structure for implementation that is both emotionally intelligent, but we can also contextualize for Namibia particularly. And here for me, it's issues even around how we think about the gendered memory of the genocide, right? The Shark Islands, for example, and other camps where women were forced into what I mentioned, the labor and the violations of the experience. Using that opportunity to now, what has been used to dehumanize, using that opportunity now to then preserve that memory so that we can be able to learn from it. For me, what also makes sense for me is saying that it has to think about even having councils, etc., not just as representation for representation's sake. It's about how do we build intergenerational leadership in that sense, right? So that bodies, for example, like a youth council, are legally recognized, but also have independence to be able to articulate fully what they want to actually see, as opposed to having advisory councils, which are just don't have any teeth, in my opinion. But are able to provide language to what is actually happening, because they are the ones who are experiencing the impact of that harm many decades later. And decision making has to be on a horizontal level for me. Shouldn't be a top-down activity. having opportunity for people to rotate leadership, open sessions where communities can actually audit and actually hold those spaces accountable, even those youth councils are accountable. But it's also helping leaders, governance leaders, council leaders to be psychosocially literate, right? That is not just about self-enrichment and self-promotion, but thinking about how to use empathy as a political skill to help conversations around restorative dialogue and emotional and ethics of power, and thinking about how we can reimagine similar platforms, right, that are actually becoming responsive to actually what's going on instead of just becoming more of the same what's in that place. And then I think lastly, what I want to really raise is that the urgent task is about integration. It's about building those psychosocial bridges between young people, work, the state-led reparations frameworks, institutional designs, youth quotas, reparation committees, mentorships, pipelines for young people, trauma-informed training for policymakers, funding for youth-led documentation of harm. All of this has to be happening on a multiple level, right? It's about creating a state that listens not just to the youngest voices as people that they see and not hear, but actually as people that they can collaborate with. And for me, the most important thing is about looking at other models that has happened across the continent, whether it's in South Africa, Rwanda, and thinking about what can we use on a contextual level that actually makes sense for us, that is alive. We need to make sure that our policy is alive, because often if you want a nation's future to feel like, we must listen to how young people talk about the past, right? And how we narrate loss, how we narrate love, how we narrate belonging is what ultimately determines whether reparations becomes a living issue or just another paper that we then pass on and move on from.
Thank you very much for summarizing that in a nutshell. Before I hand over the mic back to the facilitators, we can't end this conversation without talking about, the German's 1.1 billion pledge as a development aid,
yes,
rather than reparations. So, what are some of the risks that this poses, and, how can communities reclaim agency over its implementation? And how do you think this ideally affects young people, and what can young people do with regards to this?
I think it's important for for communities to push back, because again, they need to define what repair looks like, and communities must have that agency to define what repair looks like. We cannot hold the perpetrator to define what repair looks like. And I think it's important for them to hold feet to the fire. And when you only see reparations as aid, right, then it has lost its moral stature of sorts. Because aid is about what I'm doing for you out of the kindness of my heart. Reparations is an obligation for harm that you've actually perpetrated. And I think that's a difference that we need to often be even helping policymakers and young people must help people to understand that aid is something that somebody does because they like you and they're happy or whatever, but not recognizing, but have no obligation at all. And I think that's where the difference that we need to differentiate. By accepting it as development aid, I think we risk transforming this issue of this reckoning into just another budget line, in my opinion, which can be later rebranded or reduced, because it's over 30 years. It's not 1 billion that you're getting now. It's staggered over 30 years. So in 5 years, if they change their minds, they can stop it. So that for me is where it can become a political toy as well. And it undermines for me the justice legitimacy, right? And continues to just deepen that dependency idea of that unequal engagement between parties. So for me, to reclaim that, descendants must have decision-making power over how those funds are allocated, whom they're allocated to, and how it's spent, and they must define what that repair looks like. It is right that they're pushing back against it, and it must move beyond development aid. Development aid can be provided in a different pot. This has to be a different conversation altogether.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I agree with you totally. Because even when it comes to the development aid, what are some of the things that have been done to ensure that the most affected communities will be benefiting from this? Do you have a proper local content policy, or this is another document that is meant, or an agreement, an arrangement between two governments that is meant to accommodate the elitists and leave out the most affected communities? So thank you very much, Stephen. It's always a pleasure having these conversations with you. And of course, as all of us have had today, justice in Namibia, and I believe the same cuts across the continent. It's not just about historical acknowledgement or financial pledges like the Germans, are doing in the context of Namibia. It's rather about restoring dignity, restoring the memory, and also, the communities having that emotional sovereignty, because they're the ones who carry the weight of violence that cuts across different generations. And I believe I was challenged after reading this policy brief, and I believe the rest of us, a challenge to think about reparations and not just as money or as a social aspect to it. So thank you very much. And I think at this particular point, we'll move into the Q&A session. And I believe, I would pass the mic back to Enya. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Angeline. It was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, Musa is here. I didn't see Musa on the call. So I was worried that she had dropped off. Yeah, but Musa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Enya. But thank you so much, Angeline and Stephen, for that insightful conversation. So much to take away. But it's now really vindicating to many of us that you've been able to track the problem and go way back as far as colonial crimes, because oftentimes when you talk about what contemporary justice means, people ask, how do we address colonial past? Are there systemic ways of doing so? And one of the ways that I think your brief has been able to just guide us to a possible intervention are those actionable ways, through arts, through dialogue, through so many institutional ways that young people can be involved in reform. So thank you so much, Stephen, for the brief, but most importantly also for leading us into understanding how young people can actively participate despite the centuries of injustice that they've endured. I will now also move over to the Q&A section. I believe many of you have been paying attention and ready to just dive into our conversation. So without any further, please do type in your questions in the chat box. But most importantly, it would be even great if you could just get your hand up and we will be able to unmute your mic and you can ask Stephen a question directly. Are there any hands? This is the perfect time to sort of let us know how you interacted with the policy brief, as we asked in the beginning, what were your takeaways? But as Angeline was also, going through the recommendations herself, any other questions that you also have for our author and our facilitator too. So we have one question. Do we have a question in the chat box? Do we have a hand that's up? Anyone more interested in saying anything? But I have a particular question for you, Stephen, as you were talking about truth-telling. It's very difficult to sort of, when you come from centuries of this type of isolation, to now all of a sudden be plunged into a situation where now you have to talk in the language or in a field like transitional justice that if you are not so close, you would find intimidating. And compounded to that, not only are you talking about your personal pain, but now you also have to now start calling out systemic grievances. Now you have to talk to politicians about the fact that you are facing basic human rights issues today. So how do you, in perhaps actionable and practical ways, empower someone in that position to step into the not limelight, but in that situation to say, I have something to say, and how do I participate?
Sure. Thanks so much for that question. And for really naming that, because really at the heart of this issue, as I said in the brief, truth-telling does sound noble and incredible, but it is a vulnerable act. And often folks don't truth tell because they don't want to be seen as othered. They don't want to be kicked out of the group. They want that sense of belonging. And completely agree with you, Mosa, that this transitional justice in its current language does feel like a foreign conversation. I have been in this work for 7 years, but more often than not, I felt like a stranger most of the time because I'm just like, what are these people saying? So I think the first thing for us is to translate is that justice. It's to expand that language back into human language. What does it mean for human beings? What does it mean